Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and it is a privilege to stand up to speak in this emergency debate, and I'd like to thank the member for Foothills for sharing his time with me. First off, I want to acknowledge the comments of the Prime Minister earlier today, and certainly acknowledge comments or other remarks from individuals in this place looking to try and find solutions to this really important question and consideration. I agree that good faith, partisan or partnership, and a non-partisan approach has to take place when it comes to Indigenous issues and pursuing true reconciliation. So I think about two basic questions that need to be asked. One, why are we in this situation? And two, what can we do about it, or what should be done? So why are we in this situation? Why are we seeing blockades and protests and economic disruption? Well, I dare say the answer is pretty straightforward. It is because Canada, through successive governments, including this government, has not done the basic work of resetting the foundations for relations with Indigenous peoples, despite the rhetoric. We all know what needs to be done. We have known for decades, but we are here yet again in a moment of crisis because this hard work has been punted. The history of Canada saw Indigenous peoples divided into smaller administrative groupings with systems of government imposed upon them. For Indians, this was through the Indian Act and the creation of the Band Council system. The work of decolonization, of reconciliation, requires supporting nations to rebuild, to come back together and revitalize their own systems of government, to self-determine. Until they do, we will never know who truly speaks for the nations, irrespective of the good work, good intentions of the hundreds of Indian Act chiefs and councils and traditional leaders who, in many cases, are one and the same. But we have not done this work. We have maintained the same legislation and policies for decades that keeps First Nations under colonial statute, keeps nations divided, renders negotiations long and nearly impossible, and does not support First Nations nearly enough in doing the rebuilding work they must inevitably do. And there are lots of reasons for this. The historical denial of rights to self-government and the denial to one's land. So too, paternalism. And the result of the perpetual inaction are situations like we see today in Wet'suwet'en territory. The Prime Minister did say today these problems have roots in a long history. That is true. But let us be honest and with respect. The Prime Minister has to learn to take responsibility. Canadians over many years have come to learn our true history and the need for fundamental change. He has been speaking for 5 years about this most important relationship. He stood up over 2 years ago in this House of Commons and pledged to make transformative legislative and policy reforms. Reforms that would be directly relevant to the situation in Wet'suwet'en territory today, that would have supported the internal governance work of the nation, shifted the consultation processes that took place, and provided a framework for better relations. We have seen, as a result of this speech, from the transformative words, honestly, almost nothing. The promise of legislation has not come. I know it is hard, but we cannot keep punting the hard work because of political expediency. If we do, we will have another situation like we have today in 5 years from now, or quite likely sooner. So here we are. What should be done? In the spirit of good faith and in the spirit of working together, may I be so bold as to offer 4 suggestions. 1, governments have to lead. They need to lead. Weeks have passed. If the Prime Minister wants to have dialogue to resolve matters peacefully, de-escalate the situation, and show real leadership, in my view, he should have gotten on a plane, flown to British Columbia, and picked the Premier up on his way up to Wet'suwet'en territory. Met with the leadership of the Wet'suwet'en and some of the broader Indigenous leaders in British Columbia. He could still do this, having regard for and respect for the wishes and the preconditions, perhaps, of the Wet'suwet'en leaders and recognizing some of the challenges that exist in their community. Honestly, there is a practice of leaders not wanting, in my opinion, to be in meetings where the outcomes and structures are not basically predetermined. We need to have enough of that. One cannot script dealing with real issues and challenges. Let's just deal with them. 2, the government should act now on making the fundamental changes that are long overdue. The government should long ago have tabled comprehensive legislation that implements the minimum standards of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and upholds the recognition and implementation of Indigenous rights, a recognition and implementation of rights framework. Such legislation would include supports without interfering for Indigenous nations to rebuild their governments. It also would include pathways for moving out beyond the Indian Act. Indian Act chiefs have an important role to play in this process. Once truly self-governing, we will know with certainty who speaks for the Indigenous title and rights holders. This is important not only for Indigenous peoples to have faith in the legitimacy of their own democratic institutions. Ultimately, the people will choose and vote on their system of good governance. It is now also important for all Canadians to know. I will be frank. The government uses language like co-development and the need to do it in partnership with Indigenous peoples a lot. But a lot of the times they use that language simply as excuses to delay or justify inaction. For decades, at least since the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples 25 years ago, we have known the foundational legislative change that is needed. UNDRIP is a decade old. This government is 5 years old, and it has been 2 years since the Prime Minister announced legislation would be tabled within 10 months. Enough is enough. The time for action is now. No more half measures, no more lofty rhetoric, no more setting up interminable negotiations that get nowhere very slowly over years and years. 3, I believe the government should consider a cooling off period where construction activity does not take place. That will allow everyone to step back and assess where things are at, clear the space for dialogue, and de-escalate current tensions. Whether this period is for 1 month or for a few months, it can be a benefit to all. In this time, dialogue between the Wet'suwet'en and government can take place. As well, the Wet'suwet'en, in my respectful view, need to take responsibility in such a period of time to have, in a very inclusive manner, again, the internal dialogue needed to bring clarity about how they will approach the future of this project collectively. And also, such a period of time may allow for explorations, as there has been in the past, of alternative routing for small portions of the line that can address some concerns, including, if necessary, government roles in accommodating the cost of such changes should they be adopted with broad support. 4, as a proud Indigenous person in this country, I know that Indigenous governments also need to lead. The main request I have heard, including meetings with the Prime Minister and Premier, is that the RCM police leave the area where they conducted enforcement activity. My understanding as of today is that the company and the Wet'suwet'en are both in the area and things remain currently peaceful. If the RCMP decide appropriately to leave, or as appropriate to leave, perhaps as part of the cooling off period, then I would expect Indigenous governments, including the Wet'suwet'en leadership, to take action, to look at reconciliation, to look at how they can move forward collectively. I know my time is running out, but I want to make one last observation about reconciliation and things that we've heard about reconciliation being dead. Reconciliation, in its true meaning, always involves a reckoning with our past, with taking responsibility, with changing course in real ways, with making the hard choices for our future. These are the choices that every parliamentarian in this place representing their constituents has to make for the benefit of all Canadians. This is our opportunity to finally finish the unfinished business of Confederation and enable Indigenous peoples to be self-determining, embrace the minimum standards of the United Nations Declaration, and finally ensure that Indigenous peoples have their rightful place in this amazing country. Gala Kassa.
Questions and comments? Qu'est-ce commentaire? The Honourable Member for Vancouver East.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member from Vancouver-Granville for her comments and for her thoughtful comments. We are actually in a very important moment in time in our history, and I think it is absolutely essential that we all in this House of Commons be on the right side of the history. The member actually proposed a number of actions to which the government can take, and particularly on the question around a cooling off period. That would mean that the RCMP needs to stand down. I think that it would also mean, and I like her clarification on it, and that is for the provincial government to pause the project as part of the cooling off period, so that the discussion that's going to take place towards a peaceful resolution can actually take its course. Did I interpret that correctly from the member's suggestions? And then if we can actually come to that place, then we would have actually set the table to say that we would do things differently, and that yes, indeed, for this entire country, the most important relationship is, in fact, the nation-to-nation relationship with Indigenous peoples and recognizing their full rights.
Hear, hear.
Full Member for Vancouver-Granville.
My colleague from Vancouver East and my neighbour for the question. As part of a cooling off period, I believe fundamentally that leaders, the Prime Minister, the Premier of the province of British Columbia, and Canadians need to have reflections around what happens and how we move forward. An agreement between the Prime Minister and the Premier, and certainly involving the leadership and the citizens of the Wet'suwet'en Nation, is important to determine the best way forward. But certainly cooler heads prevail when there has been an opportunity to reflect and plan a way forward, and I certainly would support that happening.
Questions and comments. The Honourable Member for Beaches East York.
Thanks very much, and I appreciate a number of the suggestions, including strong engagement and leadership, including Prime Minister potentially getting on a plane and bringing the Premier with him. I think that kind of engagement, and certainly what we've seen from the Minister of Indigenous Services, has been important, and additional engagement would be important. In terms of provincial versus federal actions, I understand the member from Vancouver suggesting a pause, cooling off period from the provincial government. On the federal side, with respect to cooling off with respect to the RCMP. So I understand under the RCMP Act that we could, the minister could request a review of actions undertaken to date by the RCMP on in enforcing the court order and potentially stepping outside of that court order. That would be, I think, a positive potential step, given, I think, much of the problem at the outset had to do with the RCMP overstepping its jurisdiction in some ways. With respect to requesting the RCMP to stand down, given the member's former experience, to what extent does she think direction of the RCMP would be appropriate in the circumstances?
For Vancouver-Granville.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate the question and the opportunity to speak to it. I mean, I have heard the debate all night, and I, based on my former role, but generally understand the role of the RCM police and police forces and the reality of the not having political interference happen. I know that very well. I am familiar with the authorities in the RCM Police Act, And I'm also familiar with the necessity to ensure that the RCMP have the ability to exercise their discretion as appropriate. However, there has been a conversation in this country, and perhaps this might be a result of this debate for this conversation to continue, the balance between the independence of police forces and the discussion with respect to authorities of ministers. We've had inquiries about this, Ipperwash for one. This is a conversation that needs to continue, but appropriately with political action, agreement on all sides, perhaps that would guide the way or lead the way for decisions to be made by police and the RCM police.
Okay, we're